This podcast is a Jeff Townsend Media production.
This is Jeff Townsend. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Indiana Stories. This is Jeff Townsend, and welcome to Indiana Stories, new podcast here. I've been podcasting for about 15 years. This project feels extra special to me. I'm going to be sharing some really good Indiana stories with you. Why, may you ask? Well, it's a learning experience for me as well, but I also want to help educate in an entertaining manner people around the state so we can learn more about it. There's a website, indianastories.com. There you can find additional information on each episode. There's options there to support me. There's options for a blog, signing up for the newsletter so you get this information in text form and obviously all in audio. It's available wherever you listen to podcasts, and I'm working on the YouTube portion of it now. So like we talked about, and you've read in the description, it is about the fascinating places, interesting individuals, and notable events in the Hoosier state of Indiana. It's going to be times where it's really lighthearted stories. There's going to be historical conversations that are significant for Indiana history. Then there's going to be some tragedies and stuff, quite frankly. So the show will bring you a mix of all that. So, I mean, this is a brand new podcast, putting a lot of work into it. So I share this with other people, please. I'm trying my best here to get this off the ground. Before we get into anything further about this episode, I do want to thank 3 different companies that helped me in supporting this podcast. Podden.io is the best transcription service out there, period. If you want to transcribe your audio, it's a great option. Podden.io, check it out. Boomcaster is an amazing team there, and it's the best way to record virtual meetings. It's designed, Zoom's designed for actual conference calls and stuff like that. But Boomcaster is amazing because it's more content creator based, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I do encourage you to go to boomcaster.com and check it out. And then the last one I want to cover here is podcastpage.io, the hands down best platform that helps you build a podcast page quickly, efficiently. And I'll be honest with you, if you're not tech savvy and you just want to build a website, period, I think that's a great way to go. So podcastpage.io there. Today, I'm going to share a conversation that I had with Richard Day. He's a historian in Vincennes. And we talk about the history of Vincennes and how significant it has played for Indiana and also the nation. It's had a huge impact. So I'm excited to share this episode with you. The Visitors Bureau there was amazing, so I do want to give them a shout out. And Richard was a heck of a time and a complete whiz genius, quite frankly, on the history of Indiana and Vincennes in particular. So I'm excited to share this with you. I had to do it. It was important to me. This is the first city in Indiana. So I had to start out there. It was very important to me. And I did learn so much having this conversation with Richard. So I'm excited to share it with you. Let's go ahead and just get into it. This is a conversation I had with Richard Day. Joining me today is a historian. That's what I'm being told that you're called, Richard. It's Richard Day of Vincennes, Indiana. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today.
Hello. Glad to be here.
This was important to me to discuss Vincennes, seeing how it is the first city here in Indiana. But before we get into that, I would like to take a second for you to introduce yourself.
I'm Richard Day. I'm retired now. At one time, I was the historian for the Vincennes State Historic Sites, part of the Indiana State Museum here in Vincennes. But I've been retired for how many years now, Jan? 8 or 9, quite a while. Enjoying it. I recommend it. Had I known this earlier, I would have retired 50 years ago.
I keep telling myself 30 more years than I can retire.
It's great. Take my word for it.
No, the Visitors Bureau in Vincennes has been great. I had issues reaching out to the first contact, and she was just persistent and made sure I was taken care of. So I do want to mention how great of a team they are there.
Yes, they're very good.
So, Richard, let's go ahead and get into this. So Vincennes, Indiana's first city. Can you walk us through the significance of this and that timeline and how it all happened?
Vincennes was founded by the French, and it was established because of men's fashions over in Europe. Everybody over in Europe wanted to have fine beaver hats made from the fur of the beaver. The Europeans had succeeded in killing off the beaver in Europe, so they had to come to North America. And they found able hunters among the Native Americans who wanted fine European trade goods, and in exchange they would give these furs, which would be sent over to the hat makers of London and Paris. The French were up in Canada, and they were wanting to expand their market, and so they came down into the Wabash River Valley. And they established a series of forts along the Wabash River at Fort Wayne, Lafayette, and then in 1732 at Vincennes. It was named after the founder of the community, a Frenchman, a French lieutenant in the French Marines named François-Marie Bissot, Bissot, whose title was Sieur de Vincennes. Took his name from the royal chateau over to the east of Paris. So if you want to be French, we'd say Vincennes, but nobody around here says that.
Yeah, I've never heard that one.
Vincennes. There's a very nice castle over there and a racetrack and an amusement park over in Paris, or near Paris anyhow. The Sieur de Vincennes was sent to get control of the fur trade, which meant getting the local Indians to cooperate with him. This was the Piankashaw Indians, who were a friendly tribe of Indians. At that time, France was engaged in a war with the Chickasaw Indians down in northwestern Mississippi. The Chickasaw had a kind of a stranglehold over the route from the Illinois country up where we are down to New Orleans. And the French were very uneasy about that. So they decided to try to wipe out the Chickasaw. And you had the Chickasaw War that ran from about 1730 into the 1740s. The Sieur de Vincennes joined an expeditionary force of troops from the Illinois country to go down there and attack the Chickasaw at their village of Ogulachitoka. And they went overland. And as it turned out, the Chickasaw wiped them out. They attacked the Ogulachitoka, and over the hill came a whole bunch of Chickasaw warriors and surrounded the French and shot them to pieces and took the Sieur de Vincennes a prisoner and a number of other French officers. And over a very 9-hour period, they burned them at their principal village among the Chickasaw on March 25th, 1736. So the Sieur de Vincennes established this fort here in 1732, and he was gone by 1736. So he was here very briefly. We did put up a statue a couple of years ago in honor of him down at the end of Main Street by the river. So you can see the statue of the Sieur de Vincennes. The French continued here at Vincennes. The French lost the French and Indian War, and the English came in, built Fort Sackville, which was the scene of the famous, at least around here, Battle of Fort Sackville, where George Rogers Clark from Kentucky attacked the British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton and captured him and captured Fort Sackville and made this the most part of the American claims west of the Alleghenies. After the American Revolution, Vincennes became the county seat of Knox County, established in 1790, well before there was an Indiana. And it also became, temporarily at least, the capital of the Northwest Territory. When Indiana became a state in 1800, Indiana Territory, that is, was created. In 1800, Vincennes was the capital of the Indiana Territory. William Henry Harrison was appointed the governor of the territory. They set up a legislature. We have the Capitol building here, and of course, Governor Harrison's very fine mansion of Grouseland to be seen over there. They also set up a land office, which was probably the most important thing as far as the settlers were concerned. Indiana meant land, thousands of acres of land available. Land meant independence and freedom, social, economic, and political freedom. If you owned land, a farm, you could be your own boss. And that was very appealing to the settlers, many of them upland Southerners from Western Virginia and Kentucky, and some from Western Pennsylvania, who came into the territory at this chance to become economically self-sufficient. So the land office sold a huge amount of land. In those days, there weren't any income tax or anything. So one of the principal sources of income for the territory was revenue from the land sales. They used to say doing a land office business. And for a while, the Vincennes land office sold more land and had greater income than anywhere else in the United States. So that was very important, and it brought people into the southern part of the territory. This created trouble with the Native Americans, who naturally didn't like their land being taken by the white men.
I'm sure.
And one of the leaders of this opposition was a Shawnee warrior named Tecumseh with his brother Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet. And they organized the Indians to oppose the white men's claims. They said, no more land of the white men. This land was given by the Great Spirit to his red children, and they shall keep it. And it cannot be sold unless with the consent of all of the tribes, and that will never happen. And so that's that. Governor Harrison said, we do have a right to buy land. We've been doing it for a long time, and we always pay a fair price. And Tecumseh said, you're a liar. And Tecumseh pulled out his tomahawk, and Governor Harrison pulled out his sword. This happened in front of Grouseland, the governor's mansion, at a conference they had in 1810. And it became clear from that there was going to be trouble. So Governor Harrison summoned up a regiment of United States Army troops, the 4th Infantry Regiment, and called up the Indiana Territorial Militia, and with an army of about 1,000 men, proceeded to march up the Wabash River to the principal Indian settlement at Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River, resulting on November 4th, or in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, anyhow. And so wasn't present to lead the Indians. And so Harrison, after a hard-pressed battle, drove the Indians off and claimed it as a great victory. From then after, he was known by the nickname of Old Tippecanoe, which ultimately got him elected president in 1840 with that memorable campaign slogan, vote for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler being his vice presidential candidate. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Unfortunately, he was only president for a month. He was inaugurated on March 4th, 1841, and he died on April 4th, 1841. So had a very short presidential career. But anyhow, this was the opening movement of the War of 1812, which out here in the West was basically against the Indians with some of the British allies. Governor Harrison organized an army and marched up in to attack the British, who had captured Detroit, drove them off, and forced the combined Indian with Tecumseh and the British armies at Robintown on the River Thames, about 90 miles into Canada, and defeated them. So this assured peace for the Midwest. And after that war, even though the war went on a little bit longer, settlers poured into Indiana and Illinois, and soon became possible for Indiana to then become a state in 1816. The capital was moved from Vincennes to Corydon, became the first state capital, but Vincennes was still quite a center. It had Vincennes University, which was the first university established in 1801, which still exists right outside my front door. I can see the campus from here. They established, of course, earlier under the French, the Jesuits had established a church here, St. Francis Xavier, which they went through 3 earlier log churches, and then we have the present brick church that we've seen that was built in 1826, which became the cathedral church of the Diocese of Vincennes, which covered Indiana and about half of Illinois. And the old cathedral, as we call it here, can also still be seen here in Vincennes. Vincennes was also a gathering place for immigrants coming into the territory. We had, of course, you had the original French and the English, Kentuckians, and those settlers. But then in the period around 1840, 1850, we had a heck of a lot of Germans move in. Southern Indiana, about half the population has German roots. And we had a lot of Germans move into this area around here. We have a French festival that we celebrate, but the German Beer Festival is the big festival here. And they had a society, which still goes on, the Harmony Verein, which is now the Harmony Society. They had changed their name in World War I. And it is still one of the things that can be seen, their clubhouse, the mansion that they inhabit that was built about 1838. So Vincennes was an important center for 2 periods during the time of the American Revolution, when you had the Battle of Fort Sackville, which secured the claims west of the Alleghenies for the American settlers, and protected Kentucky. It was, as they said, a roof for Kentucky, which enabled settlers to move into Kentucky. And then in the territorial period, when Vincennes was the capital of the Indiana Territory.
I think the thing that stands out to me here listening to you is Vincennes had a significant role in more than just the state. Sounds like for the new nation that was developing, it was significant for all of it.
Yes, of course, this was part of this westward movement that characterized the American Republic. The United States had been confined to the 13 colonies to the east of the Allegheny Mountains. The king didn't want to get tied up with a war with the Indians, so in 1763, he made a proclamation, no English settlements west of the Alleghenies. But with the American Revolution, they could come into this area, and the route west was through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. They settled in Kentucky, and then across the Ohio River at Louisville, and then diagonally across Indiana along what was called the Buffalo Trace that ran from Louisville to Vincennes. Most of southern Indiana covered by a dense hardwood forest, hard to get through. But the buffalo, migrating herds of buffalo, had over hundreds of years trampled down the soil and cleared away the shrubbery and trees and created a route that travelers could go west from Louisville, from Kentucky, into Indiana, and then from there across the prairie to St. Louis in the west. And so Vincennes became one of the principal travel routes. It was a crossroads between the north-south route, which was the Wabash River, and the east-west route, which was the Buffalo Trace, as it was called, which has been marked. You can still see signs indicating the Buffalo Trace.
So crossroads, that's where that comes from then? You
Yes.
always hear that associated with Indiana.
Yeah, most notably on the Lincoln Memorial Bridge that we have here in Vincennes across the Wabash. It has a big pylon depicting two Native Americans, and it is the gateway to the west. You cross there on Highway 50, and it led over to St. Louis. And there's an inscription on the side of the bridge that gives the history, pretty much as I've given it, of that westward movement and the significance. Of course, it's called the Lincoln Memorial Bridge because the Lincoln family were living in southern Indiana, down in what is now Spencer County, and they wanted to move west like everybody else. And so they came up to Vincennes and crossed the Wabash River here and then headed over into Illinois. And so that is why it's called. There's a very nice memorial to the Lincoln family entering Illinois over on the Illinois side of the Lincoln Memorial Bridge. It shows a young 21-year-old Abraham Lincoln striding for the first time on the sacred soil of Illinois.
Hey, Richard, you are a historian here. No, I'm starting to connect some dots together in my head as far as the significance of this city. My question is, what are some other, besides the establishment of colonies and everything we were going through really for about that 50-year period, what are some other issues or major things that Vincennes has struggled with throughout its existence?
Slavery is the big issue. That characterizes the early history of the United States. You had, of course, slavery beginning in the 1619 and it became pretty much standard through the United States. And one of the purposes of the Constitution, apparently, was to preserve the property rights, that is the slavery, of the people here. And it was one of the great compromise, how you were able to get the southern states to participate. After the American Revolution, you had this Northwest Territory, this land northwest of the Ohio River. And the question was, what was going to happen with that? 1787, the Ordinance of 1787 creating the Northwest Territory came about. This was established the pattern of adding new states to the original 13. And one of the things they wanted to do was to make it a land for yeoman settlers. These are free white settlers that wanted land, and they did not want to compete with the big plantations down in Kentucky and further south, Tennessee, Georgia, those places. So Article 6 of the Northwest Territory Ordinance said, there shall be no slavery or involuntary servitude in the lands northwest of the territory. However, it also guaranteed that the French settlers, which were here, would be preserved in their customs, laws, and property. And the property that the French had were slaves. At least some of the French had slaves here. So the question was, which takes precedence? How do you interpret this? And in the early days, it was interpreted to mean no new slaves. But the French here in Vincennes were permitted to keep their slaves. They were grandfathered in, as they say. And the children of those French slaves would partake of the status of their mother. So you had the children of French slave women who would also be French slaves. And there was a certain business and you'd buy a French slave. But another way of getting around the no slavery ordinance was the indentures. Indentures, for a long time, English common law said that a person for a certain fixed time could give up their freedom in exchange for a consideration. Many of the early colonists came over from England by way of an indenture where someone paid their passage across the Atlantic, and then they would agree to work for a certain period of time, usually about 7 years. However, here in Indiana, it was applied to persons of color. So the practice was you would usually buy a slave down in Kentucky, bring him up here to Indiana, say you are now free, but it would be the height of ingratitude for you to not recompense me for having freed you. So you will sign this indenture where you agree to work for a certain period of time. And if you refuse to do that, within 60 days, I can send you back down into slavery down the river. So it wasn't a free choice by any means. These indentures, there was no fixed period. And you had here in Knox County in Vincennes, a record of indentures that ran for 15, 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 99 years. The chance of a person surviving to the end of a 99-year indenture were not good. So it was a weaselly way of getting around this proclamation. Governor Harrison himself had several indentured servants, although he kept them at a fairly minimal rate of 15 years, and they did, in fact, get their freedom. But this was the big issue. As you began having more settlers moving into the state of Indiana after 1816, many of them came into central Indiana and northern Indiana, which had been opened up, and they came from the eastern states, from New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and they did not like slavery. They didn't like slavery. So they looked at the Ordinance of 1787 and the state constitution, which also said no slavery, no slavery, Indiana shall be free of that. And they said, well, what is this? And so here in Knox County, a couple of lawsuits were initiated in 1820 and 1821 that dealt with this problem. The first dealt with slavery. That was Polly Strong versus Hyacinth LaSalle. Polly Strong was a Black girl. Her mother had been a French slave, and so she was too. She had been purchased by the LaSalle family. Hyacinth LaSalle was one of the principal tavern keepers here at Vincennes. And she met with an attorney, an Eastern attorney named Amory Kinney, and initiated a lawsuit against Hyacinth LaSalle, habeas corpus proceeding, where he would present her in court and explain why it is she was being held contrary to the Constitution of the state of Indiana. And the argument was that LaSalle's attorney put was, this is always the tradition here, and that's the way it's been interpreted, and that's the way it's going to be. And the Knox County Circuit Court ruled in favor of Hyacinth LaSalle, but it was immediately appealed to the state Supreme Court at Corydon. And in July 20th of 1820, they ruled that no, the Constitution is quite clear, there shall be no slavery in the territory, therefore Polly Strong is free. And that set the precedent then. That meant that all these other slaves that were here, there were quite a few slaves in Indiana at the time, they could also sue for their freedom. Most of them just walked away and said, go sue me, buddy. But that ended slavery. But then that still left the issue of indentured servitude. So the following year, Amory Kinney again initiated a lawsuit with a Mary Clark, who had been purchased down in Kentucky, brought up to Indiana, and had been acquired by General Washington Johnson. He wasn't really a general. That was his first name. He was named after General Washington, of course. General Washington Johnson. And he had purchased her and had put her on an indenture. So she was an indentured servant. She was supposed to be a servant for 15 years. They initiated a lawsuit in the Knox County Court. And again, the attorney for General Washington Johnson, said this is the tradition. This is the way it's always been interpreted. And English common law acknowledges indentures and all. And the Knox County Court, the circuit court, again, ruled against Mary Clark. But then they appealed to the state Supreme Court. And again, the state Supreme Court and said, no, this was compelled. She didn't have a free choice there. She had to do. So this was a free choice of indenture. And therefore, indenture is also contrary, at least indenture applying to Black people in the way that it had been done were contrary to the state constitution, which pretty much put an end to that as well. So those were two important issues dealing with slavery that were settled here in Indiana, and at least the cases initiated here in Vincennes. And this kind of set the precedent that, yes, the Northwest Ordinance was valid, and these states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin would be free of slavery, which later on came in handy when the Civil War came about. And they were able to, these states of the Northwest Territory were able to contribute the troops that were one of the deciding factors in the Union victory in that eventually made the United States free of slavery after a bloody Civil War.
This has been an amazing conversation, Richard. Just to put a bookend on this conversation, in a couple of minutes, let's just assume that somebody doesn't know much about Vincennes or anything at all. What would you suggest as far as if I wanted to go there, see something significant? What are some places that you would suggest somebody visit?
What most tourists do is they go to the George Rogers Clark National Historical Park. A lot of them say the national park has really good restrooms. But then there's this big temple-like memorial, 80-foot tall, classical memorial building, and they want to know what that is about. You can go inside and see the statue of George Rogers Clark and paintings depicting his campaign, and they have very nice other places to see. We have a very nice Civil War memorial. It's one of the biggest ones around, county Civil War memorials, and it talks about of Indiana and the Civil War. There's a sign there that acknowledges the role of Mary Clark and Polly Strong there on the courthouse grounds, which is of interest. Oh, there's also an Indian mound, Sugarloaf Mound, which is on the edge of town, which is the prehistoric period of Indiana, which I did not talk about at all, but it is a burial place for some Indian individual that's buried in there. We think from around 900 or 1000 AD, about 1,000 years ago, that was used as a burial place. Or you can climb up in the mound, get a nice view of Vincennes off in the distance. But those are some of the places you can visit here in Vincennes. Oh, the Red my wife reminded me, the Red Skelton Visitor Center. The probably best known son of Vincennes is Red Skelton, born here in 1913. They were about 2 blocks from where I am right now, is his home or his birthplace. And he later on became an entertainer. He was on television. I remember when I was a kid, the Red Skelton variety show got Emmy Awards and all. It was on for a long time. And he also appeared in movies back in the 1940s and 50s, the Red Skelton movies. He was also, of course, had a radio show at one time. And then later on, he toured the country with an entertainment program. He was down in Las Vegas, and he came around all over the country. But they established on the campus of Vincennes University the Red Skelton Museum and of American Comedy. And you go in there, and it explains about Red Skelton, what he was about, and also explains about the milieu he came from, the vaudeville circuit and comedy in general on the early radio and television. And there's a very nice theater in connection with it, too. Yeah, don't by any means forget the Red Skelton Center.
Richard, this has been an awesome conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to do it, and also Jan taking the time to do it and contributing.
Did I forget anything, Jan? Okay, yeah. Heaven helps me. I've got to live here after. If I leave somebody out, I'll hear from it.
Anything you can think of, I can also put on the website or in the show notes of this episode, Richard. No, I think this is awesome. This is the Indiana story. This is the starting point, and it's very significant. So again, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you for listening to this episode of Indiana Stories. If you like what you heard, you can go to indianastories.com for more episodes and other stories related to Indiana. Also, if you're enjoying this podcast, there's several things you can follow: the podcast itself, the newsletter, and various other things. Thanks again for listening, and we will be back with another episode, and I hope you join us for another Indiana story.
And even if the world And the question is, do I stay here? Will you be back? Are you gonna come back? Will you be back? Are you coming back?